Hello, thank you for visiting. Today, I want to tell you a story. A case that seems like it only happens in a horror movie but is actually a real-life obsession. The story begins in San Juan, Puerto Rico in the spring of 2021, a story of ambition, love, and a growing darkness beneath the surface. I want you to imagine the sun rising over the city as the headlines suddenly turn from admiration to horror. That's when the name Keishla Rodríguez Ortiz becomes a national and international tragedy, and Felix Verdejo, once the golden boy of Puerto Rico's boxing ring, is swept up in a headline that no one can understand. Felix was once one of the island's most promising athletes. Born in May 1993, he has surpassed all expectations. A quarter-finalist at the 2012 London Olympics, a knockout dubbed Diamond. He has flourished in his career, racking up victories and a memorable knockout in 2014 that reverberated throughout the boxing world. By 2015, he had won the WBO Latino title, defending it several times, and Puerto Ricans were speculating that he would become the boxing legacy they had long awaited. But behind the fame was a personal life rife with secrets and contradictions. Keishla Rodríguez Ortiz, also born in 1993 in San Juan, grew up in a large, modest family, known for her kindness, love of animals, and her dream of becoming a veterinarian. She has a close relationship with her sister Barriz, her soul mate, and stayed in Puerto Rico when her mother moved to Florida after her divorce. Felix and Keishla's paths have crossed since childhood. Deepening teenage friendships are not unusual in a small community. But as the world changes, their relationship becomes more murky. They move on, but Keishla remains attached, both romantically and romantically, to Felix, despite knowing he married another woman, Eliza Santiago, in 2016. The younger Eliza, a rising Instagram model, is now stepmother to Felix's only acknowledged daughter. In public, they appear perfect. Behind closed doors, Felix continues to see Keishla secretly, obsessively. When his boxing career took a nosedive after a serious motorcycle accident in 2016, Eliza confronted him. She demanded fidelity, threatened divorce, and said she would give him custody of their young daughter if he didn't end his affair. For a time, Felix pulled away. Keishla pulled back, but her grief and fear held her back. She still loved him, even as he threatened her with fame, control, and emotional terror. Then came early April 2021. Keishla discovered she was pregnant with Felix's child. She told her sister and mother, and both urged her to stand her ground. She called Felix, hoping he would finally take responsibility. Instead, he flew into a rage. He told her to terminate the pregnancy or face the consequences. When she refused, he flew into a rage. He insisted on proof, which she provided, a doctor's certificate confirming the pregnancy. They arranged to meet on the evening of April 29. Keishla knew she was in danger but remained hopeful. Barriz and their mother urged her not to go, fearing what the confrontation would entail, but their pleas were in vain. Keishla went. Driving her own dark gray Kia Forte, she arrived, carrying the certificate, a symbol of life and hope for both of them. That evening, Felix called his friend Luis Antonio Cadiz, a man with connections to the criminal underworld. He pressures Cadiz to help him fix the situation. Felix loudly offers money and insists that the authorities will never come after them. Despite their past legal troubles, Cadiz agrees. After all, their friendship has been cemented, and Felix reassures him. When Keishla gets out of the car and talks to Felix, she shows proof of life inside her. He again asks her to stop it. She cries. She refuses again. In the heated argument that follows, testimony at trial shows that Felix hit her so hard, her head fell back, her consciousness gone. As the world faded before Keishla's eyes, Felix and Cadiz complete a plan they had formulated in cold blood. A witness, the next key figure, later testifies that they injected her with a syringe filled with poison. Federal complaints and investigators described finding fentanyl and xylazine, a sedative more commonly used in veterinary medicine than in humans. In her system, the choice was terrifying, a chemical meant to end her life quietly. They bound her wrists and ankles with wire, attached a heavy cement block, then lifted her into the trunk of Keishla's car, which had been commandeered by Cadiz, and drove her to Puente Teodoro Moscoso, a large bridge spanning the San Jose Lagoon. It was still early when they arrived. The roads were sparse, the dawn light pale. In broad daylight, two men threw her, still alive, over the railing. And as her lifeless body sank, a shot was fired into the water to ensure she would never resurface. A few minutes later, the world news shifted. Keishla's car was found abandoned in Canavanas on April 29 with identification papers inside, no sign of a struggle. The very next day, May 1, a passerby spotted a silhouette in the murky waters of the lagoon. Authorities recovered a body. In that moment, hope turned to devastation. Their fears were confirmed. Postmortem dental records and a distinctive tattoo revealed the identity: Keishla Rodríguez Ortiz. The island was engulfed in disbelief and outrage. Protesters filled the streets. They carried signs reading "Ni una más," "It's not me," and "Nos queremos vivas," "It's not me." The bridge became both a crime scene and a rallying point, a symbol of unsettled grief and anger. Thousands demanded accountability. The outrage was a turning point. Media reports that had once sensationalized the details now took on a social backlash, sparking conversations about gender violence that Puerto Rico could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, law enforcement moved quickly. Surveillance cameras captured Felix's black Dodge Durango near the bridge at the time of the crime, following Keishla's Kia. His phone, as well as Keishla's and Cadiz's, pinged locations that matched the route they later described, from downtown San Juan through residential areas toward the Lagoon Bridge. Investigators linked more than 110 calls between the phones in the weeks leading up to the attack, including several on the morning of April 29. These records, combined with Felix's own driving route and Cadiz's testimony, painted a chilling picture of targeted behavior. On May 2, Felix turned himself in to authorities. He initially denied any involvement, claiming he had spent the night at home, but his legal case quickly faltered. Cameras, phone metadata, physical evidence in the car, including strands of Keishla's hair, were undermining his defense. Cadiz, on the other hand, confessed, agreeing to cooperate. He would testify in detail about the events of the case, naming Felix as the mastermind while maintaining his own freedom. Within days, a federal grand jury indicted Felix Verdejo, charging him with kidnapping resulting in death, carjacking resulting in death, causing the death of an unborn child, and using a weapon to commit these violent acts, charges that, under U.S. federal law, could carry the death penalty. What began as a rumor about jealousy and a boxer's lies had now evolved into a trial strategy and a national reckoning. As Keishla's body was pulled from the San Jose Lagoon, the island seemed to stop breathing. News channels cut to their regular broadcasts. Her name was mentioned repeatedly on social media, accompanied by hashtags calling for justice, accountability, and change. But for her family, there was no time to process the public outrage. A funeral was needed, and a truth they had suspected would have to be faced head-on. Keishla's mother, Kayla, flew in from Florida, clinging to the faint hope that there might have been a mistake. But when she saw the tattoo on her daughter's arm, she couldn't deny it. It was her daughter. She was devastated not just by the loss, but by the sheer enormity of what had happened. Keishla had trusted Felix. She had known him since she was a teenager. She believed, against all odds, that he would not harm her. That belief cost her life and that of her unborn child. The public saw it as more than just a murder. It was a symbol of everything wrong with how women are treated when they dare to stand up to powerful men. Puerto Rico has been hit hard by a spate of femicides, so much so that, in early 2021, the governor declared a state of emergency on gender-based violence. Keishla's murder added fuel to an already smoldering fire. As protesters marched, investigators began piecing together the moments before her disappearance. They started with the obvious: Felix. After all, he was the last person known to have had contact with her. And though he insisted he was home, that alibi quickly fell apart. His wife herself told police she hadn't seen him that night. Surveillance footage revealed the truth. The cameras captured his black Dodge Durango following Keishla's Kia Forte toward the bridge in the early morning. More footage showed that the Kia was not driven by Keishla, but by another man later identified as Luis Antonio Cadiz. Forensics began there. In the bed of Felix's truck, investigators found hairs that matched Keishla's DNA. Phone records confirmed the truth. Felix's phone was in the same location as Keishla's on the morning of April 29, traveling toward the lagoon. And there were the calls, more than 100 between Felix and Cadiz in the weeks leading up to the crime, plus several just hours before and after. The breakthrough came when Cadiz surrendered. Under the weight of the evidence, he agreed to cooperate in exchange for a lighter sentence. What he told them was chilling and matched what investigators had suspected. He described how Felix had planned the attack in advance. He had asked Cadiz to get drugs to inject, and he had brought steel wire and a concrete block. How they waited for Keishla in the truck and how the confrontation turned violent. The federal complaint that followed laid it all out. Keishla had been beaten, injected with a lethal drug, bound with wire, weighed down with a cement block, and thrown alive into the lagoon. The final shot fired into the water wasn't a mercy shot. It was to ensure she would never surface alive. When authorities arrested Felix on May 2, the entire island knew. He was facing some of the most serious charges possible. Kidnapping resulting in death, carjacking resulting in death, causing the death of a fetus, and using a firearm in a violent crime. Under the federal system, any of these charges could result in a death sentence. Yet even as Cadiz explained the story, Felix refused to plead guilty. He insisted he had nothing to do with Keishla's death. His legal team tried to clear him up, claiming that Cadiz had fabricated the details to save himself. But the physical evidence, the hair, the phone records, and the surveillance footage proved Cadiz was extremely detailed. And then the funeral came. On May 8, the streets of San Juan witnessed one of the most heartbreaking farewells the island had seen in years. Keishla's white coffin was brought to the cemetery not by hearse but by horse-drawn carriage. White petals fell from above, a symbolic farewell to a young woman who had lost her life too soon. Television cameras captured the moment her mother clutched the coffin, sobbing and whispering. Her sister stood by, wearing a shirt bearing Keishla's photo. Thousands of mourners gathered, not just to mourn but to make a statement: this cannot happen again. Politicians, celebrities, and athletes condemned the murder. Feminist groups seized on the tragedy to demand stronger protections for women, better enforcement of the ban, and punishment for those who threatened them. But behind the public mourning was a private pain. Keishla's mother recalled her final days, wondering if there was any way to prevent her from going to that meeting. Her sister writhed in guilt. She had warned her, but it was not enough. And all the while, the man they believed responsible stood trial, denying everything. It was hard not to notice the imbalance. Felix was a famous athlete, well-connected and wealthy. Keishla was a veterinarian devoted to her pets and her young family. One had a publicist and a lawyer. The other had a mother and sister. Yet in death, Keishla has a stronger voice than she ever had in life. For Puerto Rico, the case is a mirror image. It raises a difficult question: how many times have women's cries for help been ignored until it was too late? Keishla told her family she was being threatened. She tried to leave the relationship. She even took steps to build her own life, separate from Felix. But eventually love, fear, and their complicated past pulled her back into his orbit with deadly consequences. By the summer of 2021, the trial had begun. Delays due to the pandemic have delayed hearings, but the evidence continues to pile up. Cadiz's cooperation means prosecutors can reconstruct the timeline almost minute by minute. Forensic reports match his testimony. Phone records match his testimony. The physical condition of Keishla's body matches his testimony. For the jury, the case was no longer about whether Felix was guilty, but about how harsh his punishment should be. Federal prosecutors considered seeking the death penalty. Keishla's family, however, had other wishes. They wanted him to spend the rest of his life behind bars, facing the reality of what he had done every day until his last breath. That moral choice to reject the death penalty and ask for life in prison spoke volumes. It was not forgiveness. It was a slow, agonizing, inescapable sentence. But even with all this evidence, one question remained. How did someone go from a promising athlete to a convicted murderer? What broke inside a person to turn them into a predator toward the person they claimed to love? As the trial began, the story was already in the public eye. In Puerto Rico, people weren't asking whether Felix Verdejo was guilty. They were waiting to see what sentence the justice system was willing to impose on one of the island's former sports heroes. The federal courthouse in San Juan became the stage for this final act. Security was tight. Reporters filled the stands, pens rustled, cameras clicked as Felix was led in. He still had the demeanor of a fighter, head held high, eyes looking straight ahead, but he had lost the confidence that had once lit up the boxing arena. Every step forward now was a step toward a life he could no longer control. Prosecutors opened the trial with a clear and devastating statement. They told the jury it was a carefully calculated crime, driven by pride, control, and fear of scandal. They portrayed Felix not as a man who made a rash decision in the heat of the moment, but as someone who planned step by step to wipe out Keishla and her unborn child. They had a powerful witness, Luis Antonio Cadiz. Under oath, Cadiz stuck to the same account he had given investigators months earlier. His voice was calm but heavy as he described Felix's plea for help. It began with a conversation about solving a problem and turned into a plan for murder. He described taking the syringe, the wire, the concrete block. He recounted to the jury the grisly details of April 29, the argument in the truck, Felix beating Keishla, the injection, the tying up, and the final act on the bridge. Cadiz was unsparing in his testimony. He admitted his role, his decision to do it for the money and loyalty. The jury watched him closely, a man testifying against an old friend in exchange for leniency. The defense seized on this point immediately. Felix's lawyers, in turn, tried to discredit Cadiz. They argued that he was the real killer, fabricating the story to save himself by blaming a celebrity. They argued that the physical evidence could be interpreted in other ways, that the hair in the truck did not necessarily mean murder, that the phone records merely proved that the two men had been in contact. But the prosecution countered with hard science and hard facts. They called in forensic experts who confirmed that the hair found in Felix's truck was more than a random trace. It was consistent with a violent struggle. They showed the jury the exact route from San Juan to the bridge, reconstructed from cell phone tower data, matching Cadiz's account down to the minute. They showed surveillance footage showing the two cars in sequence, leaving little doubt as to who was behind the wheel. Then came the medical testimony. A forensic pathologist described the injuries on Keishla's body, consistent with blunt force trauma and chemical injection. A toxicology report confirmed the presence of fentanyl and xylazine, both powerful drugs capable of causing rapid unconsciousness or death. The jury saw the cold motive behind the scheme in these details. This was not an accident, it was not a loss of composure. It was intentional. Felix himself chose not to testify. He sat silently throughout the trial, sometimes leaning toward his attorney to whisper, sometimes staring at the floor as witnesses recounted the murder. His wife, now estranged, also testified that she had not seen him at home during the time he said he was there, and admitted that she had long suspected an affair with Keishla. The emotional weight of the trial was inescapable. Keishla's family attended every day, her mother clutching a photo of her daughter, her sister wearing a lock of Keishla's hair. Their faces said everything that words could not. The closing arguments made the case clear. Prosecutors reminded the jury that Keishla was a living, breathing person, a daughter, a sister, a friend who dared to hold her child and tell the truth. And for that she was bound, drugged, and thrown into the lagoon as if she were a piece of trash. The defense urged the jury to question the motives of the government's star witness. They argued that Cadiz had manipulated her testimony to lessen her own sentence. But by then, the weight of the physical evidence combined with the precise timeline and expert testimony made it nearly impossible to pin the blame on Felix. The jury had been deliberating for hours, not days. When they returned, the courtroom was silent. The foreman stood up and read the verdicts one by one. Guilty of kidnapping resulting in death. Guilty of carjacking resulting in death. Guilty of causing the death of a fetus. Guilty of using a firearm in a crime of violence. Each word hung heavy in the air. Felix sat motionless, staring ahead, reality settling in. Cadiz was also found guilty, but his cooperation ensured a different sentencing process. The verdict hit the public like a thunderbolt. Outside the courthouse, the crowd chanted Justicia para Keishla and Ni una más. Some cried, others raised their fists in silent solidarity. For Keishla's family, it was a bittersweet victory. No conviction, no sentence could bring her back, but the admission of guilt was important. It told the world that her life mattered, that the murder would not be overlooked just because her killer was famous. Now came the question of punishment. Under federal law, the crime could have carried the death penalty. But Keishla's family was adamant they wanted him to live, to spend each day behind bars with a clear understanding of what he had done. They believed that death would be too easy, that a slow life in prison was a truer form of justice. The judge set a sentencing date. Meanwhile, the case has left a deep mark on Puerto Rican society. It has become a rallying cry for activists, a talking point in political debates, and a reminder that fame is no shield against accountability. But it has also raised a deeper, more difficult question to answer. How many other women's stories have ended in silence because no one listened in time? Keishla's name has become a succinct reminder of that. When the verdict came, it did not close the story. It even opened a new chapter, one in which Puerto Rico had to ponder what Keishla's case really meant. In the months that followed, the federal court prepared to hand down its sentence. Prosecutors could have asked for the death penalty. The evidence was there. The brutality of the crime on a pregnant woman done on purpose fitted the criteria. But the family's position never wavered: life without parole. For them, it wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring Felix Verdejo lived every day in prison, stripping him of the fame, fortune, and public admiration that had come to define him. It was about making him live with the knowledge of what he had done. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom had a different feel than the courtroom. The air was heavy with emotion, but also with a certain resignation. The judge read the charges again, each one carrying an immeasurable weight. And then, he pronounced the sentence: life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. It was exactly what Keishla's family wanted. There would be no pleas for freedom, no early release. The once promising boxer who had given Puerto Rico Olympic hopes would die behind bars. Luis Antonio Cadiz, whose testimony helped cement the conviction, faced his own fate. His cooperation helped him secure a lighter sentence. But the years that followed were a reminder that his role had also ruined the lives of others. Outside the courthouse, the mood was bittersweet. Activists held signs and chanted Keishla's name. Some hugged and cried, others stood silently. The victory was real, but it came at a high price. In the weeks since the verdict, Keishla's family has begun to speak more openly about her life, not just her death. They shared photos of her with her beloved pets, videos of her laughing with her sister, stories of her quiet devotion to her work at the veterinary clinic. They wanted the world to remember her not just as a victim, but as a whole person with a life worth living. Puerto Rican media re-examined the timeline of her relationship with Felix, highlighting the red flags, the threats, the attempts to control her, the vicious cycles of breakups and reconciliations. Domestic violence experts pointed to the prevalence of these behaviors and how often they escalated into fatal violence. Her murder became a rallying point for a broader discussion. In public squares and on social media, people began to ask difficult questions. Why do so many women feel helpless when a relationship becomes dangerous? Why are bans, even when they are in place, often ignored or not enforced? Why is gender-based violence still seen as an individual tragedy rather than a systemic crisis? The responses were jarring. Puerto Rico was in the midst of a state of emergency over femicide. Keishla's case demonstrated that even high-profile victims could be overlooked. If this had happened to her, a woman whose family was willing to speak out, whose killer was a public figure, what chance did others have? Grassroots organizations seized the moment. They held vigils, marches, and conferences. They pressed lawmakers to strengthen victim protections, increase funding for shelters, and train police to handle domestic violence more effectively. Keishla's name added to the list of women whose deaths had forced the island to take a hard look at itself. Her story was echoed in speeches, printed on protest signs, and whispered in warning moments between friends. Be careful. Remember what happened to her. For her family, life will never be normal again. Her sister, once her closest confidant, struggles with guilt, recalling every warning, every conversation, wondering if there was anything more she could have said or done. Her mother carries a dull ache, one that no sentence, no movement, no public cry can erase. But they also carry a determination. In interviews, they speak not only of their grief, but also of their hope that Keishla's death will save others. That by telling her story loudly and repeatedly, they might motivate others to leave dangerous situations before it's too late. And somewhere in federal prison, a man who once believed himself untouchable now wakes up every morning to the sound of his cell door slamming shut. A daily reminder that no amount of talent, no amount of fame can erase the truth of what he did. Keishla's legacy lies not in the brutality of her death, but in the power of the voices that have emerged since. In the marches that continue to take place on the streets of San Juan. In the demands for accountability that grow louder with each passing day. Her story has become a warning, a call to action, and a promise that those who harm will face justice and those who are silenced will be heard. And for those who loved her, there is one more truth. Although Keishla Rodríguez Ortiz is gone too soon, she will never be forgotten. Hello, thank you for visiting Echoes of Crime. Today, I want to tell you a story about a case that seems like it only happens in horror movies, but is actually a real haunting story. When the medical staff entered the VIP room of a luxury restaurant in the capital Astana, they knew they were too late. On the sofa, a young woman lay motionless. Her face was purple and swollen, bruises were all over her body, her eyes were half closed as if she still had the last vestiges of panic. The person who called the ambulance was not a random passerby, but her husband, a powerful former minister who once stood at the pinnacle of Kazakhstan's politics. But the call came too late. The coldness of the corpse had spread, signaling that she had passed away many hours before. And what shocked the whole country was the accusation. The once celebrated man had abused his wife for 7 hours, right there, until she took her last breath. There are stories that make people ask, how could a face that appeared on the front pages of the press, praised as a symbol of the young generation of leaders, turn into a person who is outraged by the whole society? His name is Kwandik Bishimbayev, and if you just look at his resume, this is the model of success that many people dream of. Born in 1980 into a powerful family, his father was a member of parliament. His mother was a successful businesswoman. Kwandik grew up surrounded by diplomatic banquets, compliments, and powerful relationships. He holds 3 university degrees, received a scholarship to study in the US, and successfully defended his doctoral thesis in economics at the age of 26. Kwandik's career path was so fast that it was dizzying. From a bank, a large corporation, and then becoming the Minister of National Economy at the age of 36. But the glory did not last a year before the scandal struck. Kwandik was arrested for accepting a huge bribe and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. That should have been the end of his career. However, just a year later he was acquitted and pardoned. For ordinary people, this was a shock. For Kwandik, it seemed to reinforce the belief that the law could not reach her. Meanwhile, in another city, a young girl was also writing her own story. Sultanat Nukanova, born in 1992, is the youngest daughter in an intellectual family. She has been passionate about astrology since high school, reading books and making horoscopes for her friends. Unexpectedly, her talent helped her become famous on social networks. She opened a consulting service, accepting all female clients, and her appointments were booked months in advance. Independent, beautiful, and full of energy, Sultanat does not need anyone to back her up to have a fulfilling life. Fate, or a cruel joke, brought Kwandik to Sultanat in the spring of 2022. The first time he saw her picture online, he immediately tried to approach her. But when he scheduled a consultation, he immediately received a refusal. "I only accept female clients." For most men, that answer would be enough to stop, but not for Kwandik. He was used to being pampered, used to seeing the door open every time he knocked. The rejection only made him more determined. The constant messages, the compliments, the stories that evoked pity. Little by little, he turned his persistence into pressure. Sultanat's friends began to hear about her persistent admirer. But then somehow, the steadfast woman agreed to meet. A direct consultation, which seemed like just a job, turned into a turning point in her life. No one understood what happened in the following months. But less than 3 months later, Sultanat announced her engagement to Kwandik. The family was shocked. Friends were surprised. She had said outright that they were not compatible, even doing her own horoscope and seeing it clearly. But then, in December 2022, a lavish wedding took place. They did not register their marriage legally, only had a Muslim ceremony, but in the eyes of outsiders, they were a happy couple. In the early days, Sultanat often showed off her husband online, calling him her golden husband. He gave her luxurious gifts, took her to flashy parties. Everything looked like a fairy tale. But this fairy tale was written by a hand accustomed to hiding secrets. Because right after the wedding ended, the prince began to build a golden cage. Sultanat moved in with her husband's family. Her mother-in-law loved her, but Kwandik quickly tightened her control. She was not allowed to invite her parents or friends to her house. On New Year's Day, just because Sultanat gave her relatives a bottle of perfume she had not used, Kwandik became angry and turned the banquet table upside down. That was just the beginning. Less than 2 months later, Sultanat's brother received a message from his sister. A selfie with a bruised face and the words, "Don't ask anything." She disappeared from contact, then suddenly returned to her husband, explaining that she still loved him and wanted to save the marriage. Short trips appeared again, happy photos were posted, but on her arms and face were still bruises that were hard to hide. Gradually, Sultanat withdrew from work. She skipped appointments, stopped posting professional content. All communication had to go through her husband. Friends saw her less. To the outside world, she was still the lucky wife. But inside, the golden cage was becoming cramped, suffocating to the point of suffocation. And then one day she told her best friend, "He controls everything, forbids me from working, forbids me from seeing my parents, always suspects me of betrayal, and he beats me." The friend advised her to leave immediately. Sultanat just shook her head, almost in despair. "I don't need advice, I just want to talk." The question now was no longer whether the cage would be locked, but when it would completely collapse. And when it collapses, who will be left to open the door for her? In the first months after the wedding, outsiders would see Kwandik Bishimbayev as a model husband. He always appeared by his wife's side with affectionate eyes, tight hands, polite smiles. Photos on social networks are full of luxurious dinners, romantic trips, expensive gifts. But for Sultanat, all of that is just the outer layer of a wall that is closing in around her. That cage starts with seemingly harmless things. "Don't meet your friends too much, they will only distract you. I want you to quit your job, stay home, I will take care of everything. You should spend more time with my family." The words were wrapped in a sweet voice but contained an absolute command. Sultanat was an independent person, but gradually, she found that all her decisions had to be approved by her husband. She was no longer free to have lunch with friends, could not have coffee with female guests like before, and even had to consider the timing when calling her mother. Messages came on her phone. Kwandik asked to see them. Social networks he checked. The small limits at first became high walls, then turned into invisible prisons. The first Tet after the wedding, Kwandik's family held a small party. When a relative brought a gift, Sultanat, out of politeness, gave back a bottle of high-end perfume that her husband had just bought for her, but she had not used yet. It seemed like nothing worth mentioning, but to Kwandik it was an insult. In front of his family, he yelled, accusing her of wasting her husband's things and not knowing how to appreciate them. Then he turned the banquet table upside down, food, wine glasses, and broken pieces flying everywhere. The Tet atmosphere turned into a storm of anger. Shortly after, Sultanat's brother received a text message from his sister, a selfie of her bruised face and bloody lips. With the short message, "Don't ask anything." He quickly called, but she didn't answer. Worried, he called Kwandik. The man's voice was cold. "My husband and I have a business, don't interfere." A week later, Sultanat suddenly reappeared, explaining that she loved her husband and wanted to give him a chance to change. Kwandik now transformed into a gentle man. He gave her gifts, promised to change, and even took her on vacation to the Maldives. The photos at the resort were filled with sunshine and laughter. But under her clothes, on her arms and shoulders, there were still visible bruises. Then one day Sultanat confided to her best friend, "He controlled everything. He forbade me from working, forbade me from seeing my parents, always suspected me of betraying him and beat me." The friend was shocked and advised her to leave immediately. Sultanat just shouted, "I don't need advice. I just want to talk." Thinking back on that sentence, it sounded like a strangled cry for help. Her family advised her to leave Kwandik many times, but each time he tried to entice her, begged her, even went to her parents' house asking for a last chance. Sultanat softened, partly because she wanted to believe that he could change. Another, deeper part was the fear of what would happen if she left. In the summer of 2023, Sultanat tried to escape. She went to her parents' house, saying she needed time to think. Just a week later, Kwandik showed up, promising to move out, just the two of them, to avoid conflict with his family. She agreed. She also believed that if they had children, things would be different, but that belief only drove her deeper into the locked cage. By October, Sultanat tried to escape again. She rented a separate apartment with the help of her brother. Less than 10 days later, she was back with her husband. They had a Muslim wedding ceremony, again a sign that she wanted to renew the marriage, or at least convince herself that love was still there. On November 5, they held a party at Kwandik's cousin's restaurant. Family and friends were present. They saw a gallant husband caring for every gesture, holding his wife's hand without letting go. Everyone believed that maybe this time everything would be better. But no one knew that just 4 days later, Sultanat would die right where they were sitting. On the night of November 8, the couple went with friends to see a performance by the famous singer Dimash Kudaibergen. In the middle of the show, they left their seats and left. No one knew what they were arguing about, only that Sultanat's eyes were heavy and Kwandik was tense. They did not go home but drove straight to the familiar restaurant where Kwandik's cousin was the owner. Here they entered a private VIP room. The camera recorded Kwandik taking wine from the counter and closing the door. The music stopped, replaced by arguing. A moment later, Sultanat called her brother, saying she would go to his house to sleep. Her voice was determined, as if she had made up her mind to leave her husband, but she never made it. Outside the VIP room, the camera recorded Sultanat trying to step out, but Quandic grabbed her arm, shook her hard, and pressed her against the wall. She hid in the bathroom and he kicked the door open. From then on, the door was closed, and for hours, only the two of them were inside. 7 hours, every knock from the staff. Every inquiry was brushed aside by Quandic. In the morning, when she opened the door, Sultanat's face was disfigured with bruises. But instead of calling an ambulance, Quandic called a fortune teller asking if his wife was okay. The fortune teller said she was just drunk and needed to sleep, and so he ignored her. By noon, Sultanat was no longer breathing, but the bad things did not end there. At noon on November 9, 2023, in the luxurious VIP room of a restaurant in the capital Astana, a leather sofa became the eternal resting place of a woman who was only 31 years old. Sultanat Nukanova, a girl once described by friends as strong, independent, full of energy, was now motionless, her face disfigured by bruises, her body covered with wounds. But that fateful moment had begun many hours earlier on the evening of November 8. That night, after leaving the concert, Quandic Bishimbayev and Sultanat entered a private VIP room in Quandic's cousin's restaurant. The door closed, blocking all outside views. At first, they drank. Only a moment later, the atmosphere became tense. The hallway camera recorded Sultanat trying to walk out, her face determined. She called her brother, saying that she was going to sleep at his house because she had decided to leave her husband. But before she could get far, Quandic chased after her, grabbed her hand, and pulled her back. He didn't just hold her hand, he shook her hard, pinning her against the wall. Sultanat tried to break free, then ran into the bathroom to escape. But immediately the door was kicked open. From that moment on, she had no way out. What happened inside the VIP room for the next 7 hours was not recorded by the camera. But the results left on Sultanat's body and what the staff heard painted a horrifying picture. It wasn't a few minutes of anger, it was a long torture. The restaurant staff heard arguing, the sound of objects colliding, then silence, then shouting again. Several times they knocked on the door to ask, but Quandic angrily waved them away. Nothing, leave us alone. No one dared to intervene further. He was the powerful man, the owner of the restaurant, the boss in their eyes. As the sky began to lighten, Sultanat could barely stand. The camera recorded the moment she and her husband walked out of the room. Her face was swollen, her lips were bleeding, her steps were staggering. She looked at herself in the mirror in the hallway, seemingly horrified by her reflection. But instead of taking her to the emergency room, Quandic grabbed her shoulders and forced her back into the room. That was when hell closed the door again. According to the later indictment, in the following hours, Quandic continued to beat, kick, punch his wife, even dragging her by the hair across the floor. The repeated blows left no intact place on her body. At one point, Sultanat allegedly took off her jewelry and clothes and threw them down the toilet. According to some accounts, she did it to prove, "I don't need anything from you." But it is also possible that Quandic forced her to do so as a form of humiliation. Whatever the cause, Quandic's anger flared up, and then Sultanat's body could no longer support itself. Around noon, her breathing became weak, then stopped. But even then, instead of calling an ambulance, Quandic called a fortune teller. He asked if his wife was all right. The answer was chilling: "She's just drunk, let her sleep." Hearing this, Quandic calmly sat back down. He even thought he heard snoring, in fact, the dying wheezing of a person. Only when complete silence fell in the room did he call his cousin Bakitsin Bajanov to come to the restaurant. But at that moment, their first concern was not to save people, but to erase the traces. They dismissed the staff, closed the restaurant. Then they began deleting the data from the security cameras both inside and outside. They believed that if they deleted everything, no one would know what had happened. But fortunately for the truth, the data was later recovered by technicians. It was only in the evening, when Sultanat's body was cold and rigor mortis had set in, that an ambulance was called. But when the paramedics entered, they immediately understood that there was nothing left to do. The bad news spread quickly. Sultanat's brother received a call asking, "Is what is being posted on social media true?" He didn't believe it. But when he got to the restaurant, he saw a row of police and security tape. An officer approached and offered his condolences. Those words were like a knife that tore apart his last hope. The police immediately arrested Quandic at the scene. His cousin was also detained on charges of aiding and abetting the crime. But from the very beginning, Quandic tried to paint the story in a way that was favorable to him. He insisted that Sultanat was drunk, fell, and caused most of the injuries himself. The bruises, he explained, were caused by her staggering into the furniture or when he picked her up. No matter how implausible his testimony was, one thing Quandic was sure of: his position and connections could turn things around. He had escaped prison for corruption before. Why couldn't he escape again? But this time, it's not just a murder case. It was a brutal murder in the heart of the capital, in a society increasingly vocal against domestic violence. And the death of Sultanat, a young, educated, once successful woman, became a symbol of national outrage. Yet, amid the storm of protests, Quandic remained inscrutable. He requested a jury trial, a strategy that was supposed to reduce the likelihood of a life sentence. Why did a man accused of torturing his wife for 7 hours believe he could still get away with it? And are the people on the jury strong enough to stand up to the terrible pressure of power and money? There are many details behind this case that will leave people speechless. If you find it worth listening to, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. In March 2024, 4 months after Sultanat Nukhanova's death, the Quandic Baysimbayev case officially entered the trial stage. The whole of Kazakhstan was holding its breath. Photos of the bright-eyed young woman that had been posted online were now shared with hashtags demanding justice. Television news opened with images of long lines of people standing in front of the court, holding banners protesting domestic violence. Sultanat's family demanded a maximum public trial, with the press and media allowed to report every development. They knew that without public scrutiny, the chances of justice were slim. Quandic and his lawyers, on the other hand, chose a different path: a jury trial. Under Kazakh law, a life sentence can only be imposed if all jurors and judges are in complete agreement. With just one negative vote, the life sentence would be reduced to a fixed-term sentence. For a wealthy former minister who understood how power worked, this was a golden opportunity to escape the heaviest sentence. From the very beginning, the defense's tactics were clear: to degrade the victim and turn the murder into a family accident. In court, Quandic wore a neat suit, his face calm. He completely denied the accusation of killing his wife with particular cruelty. Instead, he painted a story that the two of them were drinking that day. Sultanat was drunk, lost control, fell many times on the table and chairs on the floor. The bruises, according to him, she caused them herself. He even claimed to have tried to save his wife, that when he saw her unconscious, he panic-struck her, performed artificial respiration. The marks on the victim's neck, which the forensics determined were strangulation marks, he explained as traces of treatment. But the truth was not on his side. The prosecutor showed the court the recovered security camera footage. The images made the courtroom silent. Sultanat walked out into the hallway with a swollen face and bruised lips, trying to keep her distance from her husband. Quandic approached, grabbed her hand, shook her hard, forcing her back to the VIP room. In another scene, he grabbed her shoulder, pinned her against the wall. The image was completely contrary to the no-violence testimony. Witnesses, restaurant employees, said they heard arguing and banging all night but did not dare to intervene because Quandic was the owner. One employee clearly remembered. When they knocked on the door to ask, Quandic shouted, "Nothing, go away." The Sultanat's family could not sit still and listen to those excuses. Her mother, her voice trembling but determined, told the court, "My daughter died with her face so disfigured that I couldn't even look at her one last time. Now he wants to call it an accident." Her father, usually calm, could not hide his anger. If this is not a life sentence, where is the justice? A surprise figure in the days of the trial was Quandic's ex-wife, the mother of his 3 children. Years ago, when Quandic was arrested for corruption, she was the one who publicly defended him. But this time, she stood on the side of truth. She said that their marriage lasted 14 years, but since the birth of their second child, Quandic became domineering, selfish, often had affairs, and gradually revealed his aggressive nature. Once, just because of a small argument, he ripped off the toilet lid and threw it straight at her. Luckily, she dodged it in time. According to her, Quandic always knew how to choose his target. With strong women, he suppressed his nature. But with weak or dependent women, he manipulated and oppressed them until they lost all resistance. Sultanat's story, according to her, is a perfect example. The longer the trial lasted, the greater the pressure from public opinion. On social networks, people continuously shared Sultanat's image, along with messages demanding stricter laws against domestic violence. They reiterated that Even before the case was over, Kazakhstan's laws were still too lenient on domestic violence. That pressure led to a significant change. In April 2024, the Kazakh parliament passed a law increasing the penalties for domestic violence. It was a victory for the social movement, but for Sultanat's family, what they needed most was a fair sentence for their daughter's killer. However, the defense was not giving up. Quandic's lawyer sought to change the judge on the grounds of lack of objectivity. The request was rejected. They also tried to blame their cousin Bakitsin, saying that it was he who delayed calling the ambulance. But Bakitsin testified. He told me to delete the camera data first. I believed him that she was just sleeping. The atmosphere in the courtroom became tense. Every time the prosecution presented new evidence, Quandic tried to twist the story. He always returned to the same argument. I didn't mean to kill my wife. It was a series of unfortunate events. The question now was not just whether he was guilty or not. The evidence was almost clear, but how severe the sentence would be. Will the jury agree to impose a life sentence, or will Quandic once again escape with connections and legal tricks? The whole country awaited the verdict as if waiting for the answer to a larger question. In Kazakhstan, can justice triumph over power and money? On May 13, 2024, the trial of Quandic Bishimbayev entered its final stages. All of Kazakhstan waited. On the streets, in cafes, at office desks, people discussed the case as if it were a national event. In the courtroom, white light poured in from the windows, illuminating every tense face. In the audience, Sultanat's parents and brother sat silently. Their eyes were anxious, as if both expecting and fearing. They knew that with a jury, things could turn out unexpectedly. When the judge entered, the room fell into absolute silence. The presiding judge read the verdict of the jury, his voice slow but firm. The jury determined Quandic was guilty of causing serious injury leading to death, torture, and murder. The evidence from security cameras, witness statements, forensic examination results showed that this could not have been an accident as the defendant claimed. The sentence was handed down: 20 years for murder plus 7 years for abuse and torture. Combined, Quandic received 24 years in prison. In the audience, Sultanat's mother covered her face with her hands. Her father nodded slightly, as if believing that this was some kind of justice. But as they walked out of the court, they said what many others were thinking. We were hoping for a life sentence. Our daughter is gone forever and he will still get out. For them, 24 years long as it is not enough to make up for the 7 hours of torture that took their daughter's life. Quandic's cousin, Bakitsin Bajanov, who helped erase the camera, was sentenced to 4 years in prison for concealing a criminal. The court noted that he had cooperated with the investigation, confessed honestly, and had no previous criminal record. Bakitsin bowed his head and remained silent as he heard the verdict. He knew that even though the sentence was much lighter than Quandic's, the stigma would follow him for the rest of his life. Outside the courtroom, a crowd of Sultanat's family supporters applauded when they heard the news of their defendant's sentence. But the applause was interspersed with sighs. They understood that this was not just the story of one unfortunate woman, but a mirror of a painful problem in society: domestic violence and the laxity of the law. After the case, the Kazakh parliament passed a law increasing the punishment for domestic violence. The new law was partly a result of the wave of anger that Sultanat's death had sparked. But for women's rights activists, they knew that changing the law was only the first step. What was more important was changing mindsets and protecting victims from the first signs. Many editorials wrote that if Sultanat had received stronger support when she first signaled that she was being abused, perhaps the story would have been different. But at that time, society was still silent, with averted eyes when talking about domestic violence, especially when the abuser was rich and powerful. For Quandic, the trial ended, but the story did not end there. In the eyes of many Kazakhs, he is not only a murderer, but also a symbol of the corruption of power. A man who once stood at the highest political podium, trusted by the whole country, used that hand to destroy the man who once called him husband. Their wedding photos, once shared as a beautiful love story, now appear in articles warning, behind the smile can be an unexpected darkness. Sultanat's family continues their journey to seek justice in their own way. They participate in forums, lobby for policies, tell their daughter's story to warn other women. For them, each time they mention it, their hearts bleed, but it is also a way to keep the memory of Sultanat from sinking into oblivion. A close friend of hers said, Sultanat always thought she could change him, but love cannot fix a person who does not want to change. If only she had believed that sooner. The case is closed, but the big question still hangs. How can women like Sultanat never have to enter a cage they cannot escape? And when that cage is locked, will society have the courage to break it before it is too late? Perhaps that is the sentence that all of us, not just the man in the courtroom, must face. There are many warnings behind this story for anyone who believes that family matters are just private matters. If you feel that these things need to be said more, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories that could save a life before it is too late.